September 12th, 1944. Roetgen, Germany. Western edge of the Siegfried Line. The rain came down in sheets, cold, grey, relentless. It turned the roads to mud and the fields to swamps. Visibility was less than 100 yards. Through the mist, the first Sherman tanks of the 3rd Armored Division rolled forward, engines growling, tracks churning through the slop. The crews inside could feel every jolt, every lurch. The interior smelled of oil and cordite and sweat. Outside, the forest pressed in, dark pines, tangled undergrowth, and somewhere ahead, hidden in the fog, the German border. Sergeant Jake McNeese sat in the driver's seat of his Sherman, hands on the levers, eyes on the road. He had driven this tank from Normandy to the Meuse, through hedgerows and burning villages, past columns of refugees and the wreckage of German convoys. And he had seen Shermans brew up, catch fire from a single hit, their crews roasting inside. He had heard the stories. Tommy Cooker, the British called it. Ronson, after the lighter company. Lights first time, every time. The Germans had a different name. Sherbenwagen. Scrap wagon. McNeese didn't care what they called it. He was still alive. His tank was still moving. And today, for the first time in the war, he was crossing into Germany. Ahead, through the rain, the dragon's teeth appeared. The Siegfried Line was not a line. It was a system, hundreds of miles of fortifications stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea, built in the 1930s as a mirror to France's Maginot Line. It was concrete and steel, bunkers and pillboxes, anti-tank ditches and minefields. The most iconic feature was the Herculinie, the dragon's teeth, rows of pyramid-shaped concrete blocks designed to stop tanks. They stood in staggered lines, 3 to 5 rows deep, each block waist-high, immovable. Between them were minefields. Behind them were bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, machine gun nests, anti-tank guns, mortars zeroed in on every approach. The Germans called it the Westwall. They believed it was impregnable. In 1940, they had bypassed the Maginot Line by going around it. Now, in 1944, the Allies were doing the same, except this time there was no easy route. The Wehrmacht had retreated behind the Westwall and dared the Americans to break through. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower accepted the dare. The plan was simple in concept, brutal in execution. The First Army, under General Courtney Hodges, would punch through the Siegfried Line near Aachen, breach the fortifications, and drive into the Rhineland. Spearheading the assault would be armor, hundreds of Sherman tanks supported by infantry, engineers, and artillery. The objective was not to maneuver around the defenses, but to smash straight through them. German commanders watched the build-up and smiled. They had studied the Sherman. They knew its weaknesses. The armor was thin, only 76 millimeters on the front, less on the sides. The 75-millimeter gun could not penetrate the frontal armor of a Panther or Tiger at combat range. The gasoline engine was prone to fire. The silhouette was tall, making it an easy target. German tankers had been trained to aim for the Sherman's flanks, its ammunition rack, its engine compartment. One hit, and it burned. And the Panther was superior in every measurable way. Thicker armor, more powerful gun, better optics. On paper, a single Panther could destroy 5 Shermans before being knocked out. The Americans knew this. They built Shermans anyway. Between 1942 and 1945, American factories produced 49,000 Sherman tanks. They rolled off assembly lines in Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago. Lines manned by workers who had never built a tank before the war, who learned on the job, who worked 3 shifts around the clock. The Sherman was not the best tank. It was the tank that could be built in quantity, shipped across the Atlantic, repaired in the field, and crewed by men with 6 weeks of training. It was a tool, and tools did not need to be perfect. They needed to work. The Sherman worked. It was reliable. It was fast, and it could cross bridges that would collapse under a tiger. It could be transported by rail, by ship, by landing craft. When one was destroyed, another took its place. When a crew was killed, another crew climbed in. The Germans built 6,000 Panthers. The Americans built 8 times as many Shermans. Quantity was a quality all its own. On September 12th, the assault began. Engineers moved forward under artillery cover, clearing paths through the minefields. They crawled on their stomachs, probing the mud with bayonets, marking safe lanes with white tape. German mortars dropped among them. Men disappeared in bursts of dirt and shrapnel. The survivors kept crawling. Behind them, the Shermans rolled up. They stopped at the Dragon's Teeth, row after row of concrete pyramids, each one planted deep in the earth. Now the tankers had been told the teeth were impassable. They had been told engineers would need days to blast passages through them. They tried anyway. The first Sherman revved its engine and rammed the teeth head-on. The impact rattled the crew, cracked the glacis plate, and did nothing to the concrete. The tank backed up and tried again. Nothing. Other Shermans tried different angles, different speeds. The teeth held. Then someone had an idea. If the Shermans could not go through the teeth, they would go over them. Engineers brought up wooden ramps and steel planks. They laid them against the concrete blocks, creating crude bridges. The Shermans climbed. The first one tipped at a 45-degree angle, tracks clawing for purchase, engine screaming. It teetered, swayed, then dropped over the other side and landed hard. The crew inside were thrown against the walls. The driver gunned the engine and kept moving. Another Sherman followed. Then another. They climbed, balanced, dropped. Some tipped sideways and had to be winched upright. Some threw tracks and had to be abandoned. But most made it through. The Dragon's Teeth, designed to stop tanks, became obstacles to climb over. Beyond the teeth were the bunkers. They were low, grey, reinforced with steel and concrete. Firing slits faced the approaches. Inside, German machine gunners waited. They had clear fields of fire. They had ammunition stockpiled. They had orders to hold. The Shermans closed to point-blank range and fired high-explosive shells directly into the firing slits. The bunkers shook. Dust and smoke poured from the openings. Some German crews fled. Others fought until the walls caved in. An infantry followed the tanks, clearing the bunkers with grenades and flamethrowers. It was not elegant. It was not quick. It was grinding, methodical destruction. The Shermans kept moving. The Germans counterattacked with everything they had. Panzer IVs rolled out of hidden positions and engaged at close range. Anti-tank guns opened up from tree lines. Panzerfausts, handheld rocket launchers, fired from windows and basements. The first volley knocked out a dozen Shermans. Crews bailed out, running through the mud as ammunition cooked off inside the holes. But for every Sherman destroyed, 2 more appeared. American artillery pounded German positions. Fighter bombers strafed anything that moved. The infantry pushed forward, clearing buildings, routing defenders. The Shermans advanced in waves. If the first wave was stopped, and the second kept going. If the second was stopped, the third arrived. The Germans had never fought an enemy with this kind of material superiority. They had conquered Poland in weeks, France in months, because they had better tanks, better tactics, better coordination. Now, in 1944, they were the ones being overwhelmed. The Shermans were not superior. They were simply everywhere. By September 14th, American forces had breached the Siegfried Line in multiple places. Over 750 Shermans punched through the fortifications, supported by infantry divisions, tank destroyer battalions, and engineering units. They fought through rain, mud, mines, and artillery. They lost tanks by the dozen, but they did not stop. The Germans fell back. The Westwall, which was supposed to hold for months, collapsed in days. Aachen was surrounded, and the Rhineland was exposed. The myth of German invincibility, already cracked at Normandy, shattered completely. And the Sherman, the tank they had dismissed, the tank they had mocked, became the symbol of that collapse. German veterans later wrote about the psychological impact of facing the Shermans. It was not fear of a single tank. It was the realization that no matter how many they destroyed, more would come. A Panther could knock out 3 Shermans in a single engagement, but the 4th would flank it, the 5th would hit it from behind, and the 6th would roll over its burning wreck. One Wehrmacht officer wrote after the war, "We had better tanks, they had more. In the end, more was enough." The Sherman's weakness was also its strength. Because it was mass-produced, it could be everywhere. Because it was simple, and it could be repaired in the field. Because it was expendable, crews could take risks. Panther crews fought cautiously, knowing replacement tanks were scarce. Sherman crews fought aggressively, knowing reinforcements were hours away. The American doctrine was not to build a supertank. It was to build enough tanks that losing one did not matter. The sound became a constant presence in the fall of 1944, the deep, rattling growl of Sherman engines. German soldiers heard it in their sleep. It echoed through the streets of captured towns, through the forests along the Rhine, through the industrial valleys of the Ruhr. It was the sound of inevitability. The engine, a Continental radial, originally designed for aircraft, was loud, smoky, and unmistakable. German troops could hear a Sherman column moving miles away. They would set up ambushes to knock out the lead tanks, disable the rear tanks, trap the column. But the Shermans would pivot, outflank, call in artillery, and grind forward. The ambush would cost the Americans a dozen tanks. It would cost the Germans the position, and the sound would continue. By the end of September, the Allies controlled the Siegfried Line. By October, they were fighting inside Germany. The Shermans rolled through towns that had never been bombed, past factories still running, past civilians who watched in silence as the column passed. The dragon's teeth were left behind, useless, a monument to a defensive strategy that had failed. The cost was brutal. Over 200 Shermans were destroyed in the first week of the assault. Crews burned, drivers were crushed. Loaders bled out in the turrets, but the advance never stopped. Replacement tanks arrived daily. New crews were trained and thrown into combat. The machine kept running. German commanders requested reinforcements. They were told there were none. They requested air support. The Luftwaffe was grounded by fuel shortages. They requested permission to withdraw. Permission was denied. The Westwall had been breached. The Rhine was next. The Sherman was never the tank American tankers wanted. They wanted something heavier, better armored, better armed. They wanted a tank that could go toe-to-toe with a Tiger and win. The Army designed one, the M26 Pershing, but it arrived too late, in too few numbers. The Sherman had to be enough, and it was. Not because it was superior, but because it was there, because it kept moving, because when one burned, another took its place. The Germans built masterpieces. Yes, the Americans built assembly lines. In the calculus of total war, the assembly line won. After the war, historians debated the Sherman's legacy. Some called it a death trap. Others called it the tank that won the war. Both were right. It was a flawed machine sent into battle against better machines, and it succeeded because war is not a duel between individual weapons. It is a contest of systems, logistics, production, and will. The Sherman was part of a system that stretched from the factories of Detroit to the beaches of Normandy to the forests of Germany. It was part of a logistics network that could replace a destroyed tank in 48 hours. It was part of a military doctrine that valued speed and aggression over caution. And it was crewed by men who knew its weaknesses, who climbed into it anyway. who drove it through minefields and into bunkers and over dragons' teeth because that was the job. September 12th, 1944. The rain came down in sheets. The dragons' teeth stood in rows, grey and immovable. The Sherman crews revved their engines, climbed the ramps, tipped forward, and dropped over the other side. 750 tanks. Thousands of men. One objective: break through. They did. Not because the Sherman was invincible, but because the men inside refused to stop. Because the factories refused to stop. Because the system refused to stop. The Germans had dismissed the Sherman as weak. They had counted on quality over quantity. They had built fewer, better tanks and believed it would be enough. It was not. The Sherman was not a masterpiece. It was a hammer, and the Allies used it to break down the door. So there is a dragon's tooth preserved now in a museum in Belgium, painted white and mounted on a pedestal. Tourists take photos next to it. Children climb on it. It looks small, almost decorative. But in 1944, it was the edge of the world. Beyond it was the Reich. Behind it was the invasion. Between them were the Shermans, rumbling, smoking, burning, advancing. The Germans dismissed them. The war did not.